Hi, everyone. We are so glad that you're here with us today. As we get settled in, I hope that you'll share who you are and where you're joining us from in the chat. Welcome to today's program on empowering our communities to responsibly share accurate information through strong news and information literacy efforts. Thank you for making the time to be here with us for this very important topic. I'm Beth Francesco, the Executive Director of the National Press Club Journalism Institute, based in Washington, D.C. Our nonprofit organization provides training and support for journalists with the mission of powering journalism in the public interest. I'm thrilled to welcome you to this program today. And I also want to give a big thank you to the Inasmuch Foundation for its financial support of this and the other programs in our series focusing on journalism ethics in the age of disinformation. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping notes. We have a closed captioning option available if you'd like to use it. If you are joining on a desktop or laptop, you can enable this at any time by finding the live transcription button in the navigation menu at the bottom of your Zoom window. Just click Show Subtitle and the captioning will begin. We are recording this program and a link will be emailed to you as well as included in today's afternoon newsletter from the Institute. If you're not already subscribed, we're going to add the link to in the chat right now. This program is designed as a conversation among our panelists, and we hope that you'll join in with your thoughts on the topics as they raise them. Please share your questions in the Q&A queue. We recommend putting them there so that they don't get lost in what we hope will be a robust chat. We will be monitoring your questions and responding to what we can get to later in the program. And now I want to turn this program over to our moderator, Delano Massey, an award-winning journalist with a career spanning over 20 years in print, broadcast, and digital media. Delano is the managing editor of Local at Axios, where he manages unique coverage in 30 cities throughout the US. And his extensive experience includes work in those local markets, leadership on race and equity issues, and a passion for mentoring the next generation of journalists. We're also very fortunate that Delano serves on the Institute's board of directors. We couldn't be in better hands for this conversation. Delano, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Beth. I really do appreciate the warm welcome and the kind words. And also I want to thank you and your staff for pulling together this event and also the other panels, because this is a really important topic, but you have tackled so many that are crucial right now in this current climate. So thank you to you and your staff. And then also thanks for coming out. You guys have taken the time out of your day, your busy schedules to listen to us talk. And I think that there couldn't be a more appropriate time to talk about this than now. I know that there's an election, but also just thinking about like the state of the industry. Beth had mentioned that I've been in this industry for over 20 years now. And I think about how this landscape has changed so much from my early days as a police reporter, and thinking about like all of the information and the access to information that we have these days. I'm absolutely that person who will sit there and watch a movie or a television show and wonder who that actor is and pick up my phone and try to figure out who it is. And so I love that we have so much access to information now at the palm of our hands. But at the same time, things have been changing at such a rapid clip. And as we have conversations that have advanced well beyond the internet, and we're talking about generative artificial intelligence and many other things, including like pink slime websites. There was a study earlier in the month that came out. There were at least 65 so-called pink slime websites. These are sites that are sort of created to create some distrust. And information is a bit of a puzzle that we have to kind of put together. So at this critical juncture in journalism in this industry and what we're doing now, and it goes beyond that, who is an influencer, who has the right to tell stories, because everybody actually has the ability to do that now. So everybody is a storyteller, everybody has a platform, everybody can potentially have an audience. So I think that there's probably no better time for us to have this conversation, especially as we're looking ahead to the election. We actually just had a primary in Philadelphia, and in Philadelphia, where there are 65 pink slime websites. And I think, maybe starting this conversation off first, to have an introduction of the candidates, because one of the things that's really great is we have different backgrounds, and you think about the diversity of thought that's here and the way that we can tackle this conversation. I think that it's probably most appropriate for us to start by introducing the panel. And if you could all just briefly go around, say who you are and what it is that you are actually doing, but we want to keep it brief so we can get right into the conversation.
I can kick us off. I'm Molly
There we go.
Muchna. I am a project manager with Trusting News, and Trusting News is a journalism support organization that works to empower journalists with strategies so that they can demonstrate credibility and earn trust with their own audience. I'm based out of Southern Arizona, where I also am an adjunct instructor at the University of Arizona School of Journalism here.
Right, I'm Kate Starbird. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Washington. I'm also the current director and one of the co-founders of the Center for an Informed Public at the University of Washington, and have been doing research on online rumors since about 2013, and then more recently on misinformation and disinformation as it's become sort of more pervasive in our online information systems. And I'm just really happy to be here and have this conversation with you all today.
Hi, I'm Tamoa Calzaldilla, based in Miami, Florida. I'm the editor-in-chief of Factchequeado.com. It's an initiative to combat mis and disinformation targeting Latino communities and Spanish-speaking communities. Before, I was the director of the first Spanish language fact-checking platform in the US, El Detector of Univision News. And so happy to be here. Thank you.
Henry.
Yeah, all right. My name is Henry Hicks. I use he, him pronouns. I am a manager with PEN America's U.S. Free Expressions programs. PEN America is a nonpartisan national nonprofit organization. We like to say that we exist at the intersection of literature and human rights, with free expression advocacy really as our sweet spot. My work at PEN America is primarily focused around fostering grassroots level resilience to disinformation, pretty specifically in Miami, Dallas, and Phoenix. Our kind of mission with free expression and the way that we come to disinformation is we believe that in order for there to be a culture of free expression, you have to have a foundation of truth and accurate information.
Appreciate all of you for the introduction, and thank the panelists for coming too and giving us your time as well. I think that we're fortunate to have you, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. I would like to keep it as that, so that that we can walk away with many different tools and resources, and we can potentially solve the problem with misinformation and disinformation. So with that, I wanted to start with just kind of framing this topic, and you know, who better to start with than Kate, and thinking about some of the work that your team has done. So could you give us a primer on the definitions, and just thinking about like why individuals might be susceptible and influenced by so-called trust messengers, and especially in a time of crisis, and just you know, the uncertainty as opportunity. So could you kind of get us kicked off and sort of set the tone for this conversation? No pressure.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for that. Yeah, so as I mentioned, my team has been doing sort of research in online rumors for more than a decade. And we actually started, I think, prior to that, we were doing research just on social media use during crisis events. And one of the interesting things about crisis events is they turn out to be places where, or events where rumors are common, in part because rumoring often comes from this very natural place of trying to make sense of information under conditions of uncertainty. And crisis events have a lot of uncertainty. And so what we see during an event with uncertainty and ambiguity is people try to come together to try to make sense of what's happening, to try to come up with explanations for what's happening, and come up with for theories, understand causes, these kinds of things. And so it's a very natural thing for us to do when we're experiencing chaotic times, whether that is, you know, a natural disaster like we might see, or even like election events as we see. So what we sometimes say is that uncertainty powers the rumor mill, and these crisis events became a place that we could kind of study it. And so we started out with that, and then we began to use other kinds of terms, because over time we realized we weren't just seeing this natural process, we were actually seeing sort of manipulations of that process and some other kinds of things. So rumors we kind of define as informal stories that are traveling spreading through informal channels that may have some sort of uncertain or contested information. Interesting thing about rumors is they can actually turn out to be true. They often turn out to be false, but sometimes they're somewhere in between, and they're actually there's something that have, you know, a valuable signal in any case. And so we've actually started there, and we're actually coming back to using that term more and more these days, because of some of the ability to kind of let it help us deal with some of the uncertainty that we're seeing. Other definitions, though, we might see other terms that we might need to use. Misinformation is a term you'll see. Misinformation is information that's false, but not necessarily intentionally false. So a rumor that turns out to be false would become misinformation. And then we see misinformation used as an umbrella term sometimes as well. And then also disinformation. And I think disinformation is an important term because this is something we're seeing where people are intentionally trying to manipulate our information spaces, manipulate these natural sense-making processes that we're trying to make sense of things and sort of shape them towards political or financial ends. And so we've defined disinformation as false or misleading information that's intentionally seeded or spread for some kind of gain, whether that's political, financial, reputational. Increasingly, my team has been looking at the sort of participatory processes around rumoring and disinformation campaigns, and how they're not just, even disinformation campaigns disinformation isn't just spread by people that are in the know. A lot of times they leverage, you know, online audiences and others as unwitting agents in the spread of that kind of content. And as we've watched this play out in numerous cases over the years, we've begun to see that, you know, we have a tendency to say, oh, that group is more vulnerable, or they're vulnerable on that side of the political spectrum, or that age group, or something else. But really, when you look at it, we're all vulnerable to disinformation and rumors as well, and misinformation. We're particularly vulnerable, we think, in this moment. And I think there's a few dimensions of why we have a lot of vulnerability. One may just be like, it's a chaotic time for information. There's a lot of uncertainty out there, and things are moving quickly. And so that kind of uncertainty powers the rumor mill. So we're always kind of in that state. But there's other psychological, cultural, social, and technical dimensions of what we're facing right now. And in particular, I think relevant for this conversation is there's something about the design and evolution of our socio-technical systems that are contributing to what we face right now. And socio-technical systems, I mean, sort of, yes, social media platforms, online platforms, but how that sort of changed the larger media ecosystem and how we get our information. So these social media platforms are optimized on engagement, and the information sort of becomes divorced from the context and gets recontextualized as it flows. And that creates, both of those sort of create a lot of opportunity for manipulation, and just for information that's more engaging doesn't necessarily mean it's higher quality. With that, we've also seen a disruption of traditional gatekeepers. And there was this idea, 15, 20 years ago that these online sites were going to, replace traditional gatekeepers, the mainstream media that had sort of outsized control over what people saw, and that this was going to be good. It was going to democratize information. And to some extent it has been. It's allowed voices that were previously unheard to be heard and to find audiences. But it's also been sort of reconfigured by the design of these systems. And yes, we've gotten, the traditional gatekeepers have less say, but this has been replaced by sort of an influencer-based information economy. And these influencers have gained that power, that place in our information system, in part by gaming the systems, gaming the attention dynamics of these online systems, gaming the fact that engaging information, which is often stuff that generates outrage or that's sort of very sensationalist, that's the stuff that flows the most. And so the people that were able to figure out how to create this sense of a grassroots support, even when it wasn't there, we're able to gain more and more attention. And so in many cases, yes, so they've exploited these dynamics through outrage, political point scoring, and frankly, BS, which has a technical term I didn't put in the definitions, but I'll point you to a book if you're interested. And so I think that reconfiguration of how we get our information is a significant part. It's not the only thing that we're facing it, but it's a significant part, and I think really relevant for the conversation today.
Yeah, let's see, Facebook is about 20 years old now. And I think Instagram is about 14. So we have these platforms that have certainly changed the way that we communicate and the way that we consume information. Among the things that you said that were really interesting, just thinking about an influencer, who an influencer is, who are the gatekeepers now, who has an opportunity to actually serve as the arbiters of information and how we receive that information. Henry, this makes me think about like what a trusted messenger might be or who a trusted messenger might be. Can you tell us a little bit and maybe give us some examples of the work that you've done in various places, but including Dallas, Phoenix, or even Miami? But what have you seen in this space? And in an earlier conversation, we talked about an influencer on Instagram who was creating a bit of confusion in the Memphis market, where the news publications he had a much larger following than most of the news publications there. So his ability to sort of direct the flow of conversation, that was really key and also concerning. So tell us about the work that you do and some examples of what you've kind of encountered.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so what we know is that public trust in the news is down. As you just mentioned, there's been a decline in local journalism, and so folks are turning towards social media. They're turning towards influencers to receive their information. And kind of as was mentioned earlier, the spread of or even the anticipatory fear around generative AI and deepfakes has eroded even more trust in terms of what we see online. But what we also know is that despite this crisis of erosion, people still trust their friends, their family, loved ones, folks that they engage with in a community on a recurring basis. And so even if you might have different political views, someone who knows who you are, they know what your values are, they're familiar with you and your honesty, they're more likely to trust you. This is true interpersonally as well as with news. My relatives who disagree with me on politics are more likely to read an article that I send them, even if they disagree with it, but it's because they know me. And so this is true. This is true in the case of building stronger information environments through trusted messengers, who really are key here. They don't have to be scholars, organizers. They don't have to be journalists necessarily. I'll give you an example. So one of our partners in Dallas is a librarian. She's on the front lines of the fight against disinformation campaigns against book bans and censorship pretty specifically. But by nature of her being a librarian in this community, she's someone that folks know and that they know well. She knows educators in the community. She knows the parents who bring their kids in every week to check out books. And so when those same parents are targeted by disinformation campaigns around book banning, she's a person that can speak to them. Right there at the library counter, she can talk with them using language that they already use in their interpersonal conversations. And she, as a trusted messenger, is someone who, in that moment, in that conversation, can dispel a disinformation narrative and prompt that person to consider why they were vulnerable to manipulation in the first place, where they got their news from, where they get their information from in terms of why a book should be banned or restricted. And so she, is I think, a really good example of a trusted messenger in this community that can be a really important tool as we are, working to, one, better the information environment, and then, that certainly includes partnerships with journalists. But, she's someone that we should be thinking about building relationships with, and she's also someone that journalists can, think about drawing inspiration from as they think about their personal relationships and the deepening of their existence in communities that they exist in.
It's all fascinating. I will tell on myself. I watch Girls on the Bus with my girlfriend, and what has changed in that dynamic is that there's one person that is an influencer, and I think about like how the landscape has changed in media, and it's an interesting look at this particular character when you look at the influencers, but also there's obviously an audience that she is reaching. And that's also how things are changing. And so it's one of those things that maybe 5 or 10 years ago we wouldn't have thought about, but also now we might think about it in a completely different way. And that's among the things that I had heard in that. And like who do you trust to give you information? Sometimes it is your family members, especially. Kate, like when you think about this in the conversation and what Henry was just telling us, like who is vulnerable in these situations, and what communities are actually are more vulnerable or maybe susceptible to the spread of misinformation?
I think that's a hard question. I think when you ask people, they always say it's another community, right? I think there is something about there's something about, you know, if you talk to like a crowd of older people, they're like, oh, it's the kids. Well, you go talk to the kids, they're like, no, it's my parents, right? There are, you know, certain language communities that when we have, there's the interventions are not there in the sense that like, you know, there's no support for media literacy there. The tools haven't been translated there, or if the platforms are doing something to try to address things with labels, they're not labeling in those languages. So we do see certain language communities that are sort of left out of some of the spaces where people are trying to help with mitigation. And certainly communities that have historical reasons to distrust government, that have experienced marginalization in the past, or have experienced, you know, interactions with whether it's the justice system or the court system, the judicial system, or something else. The public health system. So history of exploitation of Black Americans by some of our public health programs has led to, you know, these kinds of distrust. And so when the distrust is already there, it's easily sort of exploited by those who might want to manipulate those spaces. But I would say, like, it's a mistake to say, the problem is that community or that community. I think we're all vulnerable. We're most vulnerable when we are sort of in our, you know, dressed up in our political identities, when we're activated, when we're feeling outrage and those kinds of things. And that's not to say that there aren't things that should make us feel outraged, that should activate us to do things, but that is the place where we're most sort of like vulnerable to manipulation. And I try to tell folks, I try to remind folks that yes, we're all vulnerable. I've seen it among my own friends in the last few days, to kind of getting involved in some information flows that may not be exactly what they've seen. And where that happens, I find myself what I try to practice and ask others to practice is like, when you feel yourself being emotionally activated, when you feel outrage, we know outrage is a key thing, that a key vector of misinformation. When you feel that, that doesn't mean that you can't feel that, but just double check your sources when you see that. When that's the feeling you have, just, you know, when you feel self-righteous, you're about to score a political point, that's the place where you're probably most vulnerable. It's not to say that you shouldn't spread it, it's just double check it before you do. So I try to tell folks that we're all vulnerable. And I think, yeah, that's not to say that things are completely symmetrical. We do see elites leveraging these kinds of flows in different ways that don't quite line up sort of politically. Right now, one side, it seems to be leveraging these things more effectively for their gain, but that's not to say that means that one side is more vulnerable than another.
Okay. You know, thinking about like how to safeguard or to prevent some of this, if possible, what tools or what practices could we actually tap into that might be beneficial? If we could briefly just go through, I want each of the panelists to kind of talk about their work and some practices, one or two practices that have actually helped empower individuals. But I will start with Tamoa, but others, please chime in.
Yes, of course. I would like to talk about we are doing in Factchequeado. Factchequeado is an initiative, collaborative initiative to combat mis and disinformation among Latino communities and Spanish-speaking communities. And we understand that Latino communities are not a monolithic group, and we work on that diversity, and we are building an alliance with, right now we have more than 80 allies around the country in 21 states plus Puerto Rico. And the model is that those partners help us to understand, to listen Latino communities in different states, because we know Latinos and Latinas are different. They have different approaches, political approaches, different situation with migration issues and something like that. And they can publish our content, our fact-checking content, our explainers. We have been doing publishing electoral explainers about how works the electoral process in the United States, sort of pre-bunking before the debunking and the disinformation, the rampant disinformation over there. We know that more than 40 million people speak Spanish in the United States, and we think, and we understand for different studies that they are more liable to share information in social media, in Telegram, and especially in WhatsApp groups. And we have, for example, a chatbot in WhatsApp to receive the images, videos, and questions that they have in Spanish, and we can respond. We can answer their question with fact checking, with articles, with videos, etc. At the same time, I'm as a RJI fellow, we produce a bilingual guide for journalists who cover Latino communities and Spanish-speaking communities, and we have in this bilingual guide 17 tools useful for a journalist who want to approach or to reach out these people with focus in fact checking, in fact checking tools, but at the same time we think that it's not just about the language, the reason why they are more vulnerable. It's about the cultural approach, the cultural background, because I am living in Miami, Florida, in South Florida, and we have, for example, this phenomenon with radio shows and commentators spreading a lot of this information, and we understand that we have to do different things and approaches with the people who listen to the radio show, with media literacy, with explainers, with videos in the same social media platform that they share content with their families. At the same time, we have to prepare or to bring tools to journalists who cover that communities. And at the same time, we have to do the debunking of the images, a lot of images created with artificial intelligence targeting political issues, using figures like Jorge Ramos, the journalist, the Hispanic journalist in Univision. They are creating AI with his image, with his voices to deceive people. And with other things, I would like to say that we have been identifying some particular issues or subjects that are affecting or concerning our communities, and we conducted some surveys among our allies. And we understand that issues like COVID-19, migration processes, political issues, radicalization with political issues, and some points are especially presenting a gap, information desert among these communities, and we think that we have to work on that at the same time that we are working on fact-checking and debunking specific issues. Because we have to identify different narratives that affect them, to understand what's going on, what is the conversation. Well, like Kate said, we have to identify that, and then with this input and with the input of our partners in different areas in the United States, we prepare our content to reach out them in WhatsApp, in Twitter, in Instagram and on other platforms that they are using to inform themselves.
Molly, do you have can you help us to sort of think through this too?
Yeah. So again, at Trusting News, a lot of our work really revolves around, again, understanding where there is this mistrust and then helping journalists bridge that gap with their communities. And like Henry already mentioned, trust in media is definitely eroding. That probably comes at no surprise to anyone. And this lack of trust really plays directly into mis and disinformation, because if people aren't turning to you as a trusted news source or turning to your responsible, ethical news coverage, right, where are they turning for information? Either they're looking for information and maybe like they turn to other trusted messengers or influencers or people in the community who maybe don't have completely accurate information, or even worse, people who are bad actors trying to spread misinformation, or people are kind of just avoiding the news at all, right, and are kind of at the whims of whatever information finds them. And both of these are really dangerous, because we know that in general, people just really lack the skills and the ability to decipher what's true and what's not true. We hear people make these assumptions all the times, right? That like all news is fake and you can't trust anything that you read online, or everything is biased or has an angle. And what that goes to show is that, again, people don't really have these skills to decipher what's true. People don't understand, what sets journalists or credible newsrooms, their coverage, apart from other information. And like it or not, we as journalists are really just lumped in all together with every information source, and the media in general, right, which is spreads far and beyond what we would consider news organizations. And so that's why at Trusting News, a lot of the work that we do is to help journalists tell a different story about the value that they're offering, what it is that makes their news credible, what sets them apart from other information sources in their community. We want to make it so that when people bump up against our news coverage, whether they read it, whether they, a friend shares it with them, or whether they just see it on their social media feeds, that they can learn bits and pieces about why it is that the news we're producing is trustworthy and ethical. And then once we have kind of are building this trusted relationship, right, journalists can then work to weave some of this news literacy into their coverage. So yes, that can look like explaining what makes your coverage credible and trustworthy, but that can also look like investing in relationships to make sure that your coverage of your newsroom that is producing is accurate and reflective of the communities you're trying to serve. And then it can also look like giving really tangible tools to audiences too, like giving them information of how to debunk or see if a source is trustworthy or not, or how they can check sources, how they can see if an image might be manipulated, what sorts of things to look out for where a story might be one-sided. So there's lots of good resources on this, both from PEN America and from News Literacy Project, which I see a few folks here that were in the chat from there. So those are ones that we encourage newsrooms to share. And so we have lots of thoughts and strategies. I don't want to take up too much time because I know we have a lot to say, but we do have a resource at Trusting News called the News Literacy Trust Kit, which is just a self-guided training tool for newsrooms. So that includes lots of different strategies for things that journalists can think about in terms of demonstrating their value, showing what makes their news valuable and trustworthy, and how to set themselves apart from other information sources in the community. It also gets into, how to broach news fatigue and news avoidance with your audience, and then also how to empower your audience to be smarter news consumers and better navigate the news for themselves. So I will stick that link in the chat for folks who are interested.
Appreciate that. Coming back to Kate, I think Henry earlier had mentioned librarians and the work in Dallas, and I think you also have done some work with education and also looking at libraries. Can you tell us a little bit about that and some of the programming that you guys have built around that?
Yeah, so at the Center for Informed Public, we do a couple of different things on education and media literacy, and one of them has been to reach out through libraries, including some local libraries and more rural areas in Washington State, and then we've collaborated with folks who are doing similar kinds of things in Texas. I think the most important thing there is that there are certain pieces of helping people understand information literacy that are more generalizable, but a lot of the things that are going to work most really have to identify really specific things that vary by community and by geography and other kinds of things. And so it really is important, and we've been learning to do community engaged work where we work with the community to identify what kinds of things they care about and where their vulnerabilities are, where they want change and other kinds of things. And one of the things we've seen in our work and other work as well is when you first go out the community and you start talking about trust and deception online, a lot of them start out just worrying about scams. And just to give them some basic literacy about learning about how not to fall victim to a scam helps them gain some of the first sets of information literacy that can help them with other kinds of things going forward. And so that's become like a really productive pathway that maybe isn't as politicized or other kinds of things for having these conversations to help people build up an information literacy. But again, like it really, that insight comes from working specifically with communities. You might have an assumption of what people need, and you really go talk to them. And a lot of the work that my field does is called the participatory design or co-design, when really like it's not even that the researcher goes and does the design and talks to the community. Actually, the researcher works with the community to design solutions together. And so we've been trying to do that through a few projects. And in some of those projects, libraries become a place that has a history of information support and different kinds of things, has a changing role, has some physical space, has some resources, and so becomes a location where some of these programs can be built. But unfortunately, libraries are also coming under attack by people who don't want folks that get that kind of education or other kinds of things. And so we have to think about that as well as we're even working with libraries, that it's a place for potential interaction, but it's also a place where with folks that don't really want people to be better information consumers are also starting to attack libraries.
I spent many days in the library as a child and got lots of books and personal pan pizzas from Pizza Hut in the Book It program. So they're very important. I wanted to come back to Henry to talk about like some of the practical tactics that PEN America is using, especially as it pertains to community engagement. And we've talked a lot about, and it's come up in different ways, trust. So trust is like sort of a foundational point that has come up. But also just like being able to sift through this all and to separate fact from fiction. So can you enlighten us and talk a little bit more about some of the tactics that you guys have been using?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I mentioned, PEN America's work on disinformation is really rooted in communities and in building trust, like you said. And so we've gone about that in a number of different ways. One is we just launched an educational webinar series that is going to continue over the next several months, really targeted at community members in Dallas, Phoenix, and Miami, but available to folks wherever they may be. Working and we're inputting together this webinar series are working directly in partnership with folks on the ground in these communities. So much of what we want to do is really uplift the voices of folks on the ground and really be able to create a platform for folks who are working locally to spread the word about the solutions that they have been implementing on the ground in their communities. Our last webinar that we just did was on cognitive bias. I loved a lot of what you had to say, Kate, earlier about what makes us vulnerable to disinformation. That's kind of what our last webinar was on. The idea there is that our community members, once they're able to spot disinformation, once they're able to understand how they are more vulnerable to it, they can better recognize and counter disinformation narratives when they come across them. We've also been putting together a set of conversation guides and trainings around empowering trusted messengers in conversation. So I guess to go back and use my librarian example, that librarian is in a great position to intervene in a conversation where disinformation is present. But what we have heard from a number of people across these different communities is that they don't really feel good going into those conversations. We might all want to intervene and talk to our uncle at Thanksgiving who comes to the table spewing all sorts of false claims, but those are really complicated and difficult conversations to have. And so a big part of what we've been working to do is reach trusted messengers in these different communities, reach broader community members, and offer them really specific resources and training opportunities for here's how you can go in and have this conversation with these people that We're specifically trying to push people towards diversifying their news diets as a way to protect them against the spread of disinformation. But that conversation piece, we really see it as being pretty critical. And then just a couple other things that I'll list off quickly. We've got kind of a variety of different programming opportunities in our different cities. A number of them have been tailored towards connecting journalists with communities. In the last handful of years, we've done meet your local journalist mixers, fireside chats with journalists, and followed by receptions with different community members. I should also mention we have a Facts Forward hub online for journalists, just kind of full of resources for journalists in terms of combating disinformation in their coverage. So all of this is done to build bridges between community members themselves and between community members in newsrooms. That connection point is really key to the work that we're doing. One thing I will also say is that, just as it's important to deepen that connection with the community, we at the same time also know that that's not always easy. We know that press are increasingly antagonized, as are folks who are vocal about disinformation. All of this is politicized and is only becoming more and more politicized as we move closer to the election. But we are stronger and we're safer in community. That's the way that we think about this work. A major part of our programming as well is digital safety and online harassment support. We have an entire team that focuses on that, and they work really, really closely with our counter disinformation team around helping journalists and community leaders in preventing and dealing with threats of harassment or harassment that's online or it's in person. Just to kind of sum that all up, our counter disinformation work is really about supporting journalists and community members, building those bridges together. It's when we talk about deepening those relationships, it's about more than audience engagement. It's more than responding to comments online, bolstering social media presence. It really is about deepening that connection with the people who are reading your work and the people that are affected by your coverage, thinking about them as partners in creating a stronger information environment and not just as readers or consumers.
I will. Several points resonated. I'm going to spare everyone of any kind of conversations about my uncle and his conspiracy theories. But I do want to talk to Molly about how you actually build trust in communities. I think this is something that some news organizations really have had to figure out, because there are tarnished relationships in some communities, and they're having to figure out how to rebuild those bridges. Because it's key and it's vital, and for you to really be tapped into your various markets. So could you really help us to understand, and especially for what are the tools or what's available if I'm a journalist that doesn't have large resources or not a part of a larger newsroom or a network? What are some things that I can do to sort of safeguard? And what might you or some of your colleagues be able to kind of point us to help to do a better job of protecting information?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I love a lot of what Henry said about building that foundation of having a relationship. That's something that we see is so important in building trust, right? Trust takes, we say, head and heart. It takes that head knowledge of, yes, this is factual. This is how this news organization is working to be credible and ethical, but then it also takes that emotional trust as well, which is just being present in communities over time, doing coverage that's helpful and accurate. And so I really resonated with a lot of what Henry was sharing there. But again, I would say I would really encourage newsrooms to do work to be seen as one of these trusted hubs of information in their communities, which really involves, again, sharing what it is that makes their news credible. We know journalists just don't, in general, get credit for having careful processes and being ethical or mission driven. Again, people are kind of just view all information under the same umbrella. So the more that journalists can do work to tell a better story about the work that they do, the more we can work to build that relationship and build trust with our audiences. So tangibly, what this can look like, and what we train journalists on a lot, is inserting transparency around your processes and your ethics and your decision making into your daily coverage. So explaining, how it is that reporters fact check a story, how it is that you're covering elections consistently, and how you're working to be unbiased in that. how your staff works to be fair with coverage, how you have high standards for your publication. These are things that the public doesn't understand, and the more that journalists can insert that into daily coverage, the better. Another thing that you mentioned, newsrooms with tight resources, which is what newsrooms don't have tight resources right now, or limited staff or bandwidth. But something that I think is so important for journalists to do is to just tell your audience that you don't like disinformation and misinformation, which can seem easy, but again, people are just kind of lumping journalists and the media in all in one group. And so the more that we can get on the record about saying like, hey, actually fake news and misinformation is a big problem for journalists too. This is something that, we strive for accuracy. We strive to be really fair and careful with our coverage, and this is harmful to our work, and we think it's harmful to our communities. And then really getting on the record when there is misinformation spreading in your community, that is such an important time for journalists and newsrooms to chime in the conversation. I can see sometimes newsrooms, when misinformation is happening, the tendency, and even newsrooms that I've worked in, is to kind of be hands off and be like, well, this isn't true information, so we shouldn't touch it. But if something is at the point where it's being widespread in your community, if other news outlets, whether you think they're credible or not, are covering it and it's getting a lot of attention, it's really important for journalists to get on the record in those times and say, here's how we're covering it, here's why we're covering, why our coverage is different, why our coverage is ethical. Here's why maybe we're not covering at all, or why we think that this isn't true information. We're waiting for official sources, really these basics of journalism that people don't understand, and that can go a long way. And then another strategy, again, is one I touched on briefly before, but just really teaching people and empowering them and giving them some skills for how they can better navigate the news. I think in general, journalists can sometimes get really frustrated with audiences that there's not more news literacy skills, which I totally understand. Having been someone who moderated comment sections for many, many years, I understand that they're how frustrating it can be when people don't understand the work that you're trying to do, or just clearly aren't seeing the picture, or just jumping to quick assumptions. But again, like, no one else is working to solve this problem. It's really on journalists to try to tell a better story about their work, and to be a source of trusted information. And so, again, that can look like sharing some really basic small news literacy pieces in your coverage. If you're writing, if you have an anonymous source, like explaining anonymous sourcing so that people don't just think that you're making up a source, giving people information of how to decipher if maybe something was created by AI or not, or if it was manipulated or not, giving them resources again around sourcing, how to tell if a source is credible or not. And again, I know I already mentioned, but there's lots of awesome organizations, like PEN America is one of them, that has a lot of these resources that are open source that journalists can then share with their audience and attach that to coverage when appropriate. So those are just a few of these small, kind of easier lifts that I think newsrooms could do, even if you do feel tight with bandwidth.
We have a couple more minutes, but we want to open it up for questions to the audience. But before we do, I wanted to ask Tamoa if you have thoughts about ways that we can rebuild trust, and especially for mainstream news organizations that might have lost that because they neglected some communities at various points in time.
One of the main thing that I think that we have to do is the transparency with, and the direct communication and transparency with our audience. For example, that relation in WhatsApp, because I think that it's important for your audience to understand that you are getting me. You are understanding my culture. You are understanding what is my concern, my personal concern. And the transparency, for example, we have a kind of explainer that we call, this is what we know and what we don't. And I think that kind of transparency, when something happens and you don't understand everything, you can have this approach with your audience. Something is a dark space that we don't understand yet. And I think that the transparency, the open sources, and the direct communication in your pieces in social media, in front of your camera, saying something and speaking similar that your audience do, for example, and understanding the cultural background. Sometimes we have to explain what it means. For example, the relationship is some kind of fraudulent process in Arizona or something like this. And we listened or we understand the context. And sometimes it's something that happened in Venezuela or in Cuba or in Nicaragua and in other parts. And we have to explain that and offer the context, the big picture about where is what these people is believing in some kind of processes or fraudulent processes, because it's their background, their cultural background. And I think that if we can do that, we can build in a trust, and we can receive the direct feedback of our audience. Is my opinion. I love that you are doing. For example, we have a program that we will launch shortly with PEN America. Is a training in WhatsApp, and understanding that WhatsApp is important for our audience. I think that is key.
This is different too, and I think that that among the things that I've heard is it's been taking a different approach to the way that we might, the way that we would conduct ourselves in terms of journalism before. Explaining the process to people is something that, especially in the newspaper, my background in newspaper, that wasn't something that we really did. But now we're having a conversation about greater transparency. And I guess, Kate, I wondered if you have any thoughts on that, just about the importance of that and the greater transparency and how that has shifted over time, and especially right now.
Yeah, transparency. Let me shift that just a little bit and build off something that Tamoa said, and maybe kind of bring it back to that. And that was about sort of acknowledging uncertainty in our work, in our conversations, and whether that's a journalist or an academic as well. I think, and it's a part of transparency. I think explaining how the newsroom works is all of a sudden more important when there's an alternative that's not how the newsroom works. And so I think that's great too. But also the acknowledgement of transparency. I think there were some recommendations for crisis communicators, a decade ago, was like, make it simple, be really clear, don't leave a lot of room for uncertainty. But it turns out that a lot of the conversations we have is that, especially in the internet fueled age, the conversation's moving fast. Journalism has traditional ways of doing things that are much slower because they're verifying things. If they want to engage in that conversation, and public communicators of other kinds as well, if you want to engage in that conversation, you have to recognize that that uncertainty is not just recognized, you've got to acknowledge and have that uncertainty is still there. And so this idea that we're just going to slap a misinformation label on something that shuts down a conversation, it opens you up to making mistakes. And can be a little bit problematic, and is one of the reasons that term itself has become sort of polarizing for certain communities. We've been really going back to the term rumoring, and it's also got a little bit of a negative connotation, but at least it acknowledges that so rumors can turn out to be false, but some turn out to be true, as I mentioned. A lot of them turn out to be somewhere in between, and no matter where they turn out to be, there's some signal in that rumor that's important, even if it's false. There's a signal of what people are confused about. There's a signal of what the community's fears are. And so when dealing with a community that is sincerely believing something and spreading something they believe, treating it more as a dialogue of like, okay, that's a rumor. What do we have to learn from you about what that rumor is? And what do you have to learn from us about how to resolve some of that confusion? Could be a much more productive way of engaging. That's not to say we should treat disinformation where people are intentionally coming from outside of your community to manipulate your space. We should treat that very, very differently. But when it comes to like these sincerely held beliefs by communities that you're engaging with, really thinking about maybe more of a rumoring lens and less of a misinformation labeling lens would be productive. And that's something we're doing in our own work, is trying to treat things as rumors rather than mis or disinformation.
A question for the panel, and whoever wants to respond to this, but thinking about literacy and when that should be introduced to children. This makes me think about the book it thing again. But for young people, their parents are the trusted messengers. And should we be advocating for required news literacy curriculum in public schools? Anybody have thoughts on that?
Everyone's quiet. I think there's some
Yes.
great work right now. I don't want to keep the floor here, but I think nobody wants to be manipulated. We don't want to be manipulated. These information spaces are complicated, and I think there are efforts to try to claim that media literacy is somehow brainwashing children. We heard that a couple of weeks ago, but it's so important that people understand how these systems work. And in fact, one of the speeches a week and a half ago about how media literacy is brainwashing children was done by a person who used to go by the name Frame Game. Because this person understands framing, and they don't want your children to understand framing. And framing is what we teach in media literacy, is how content is framed in different kinds of things. And I point that out because there are efforts to say that there are efforts to push against media literacy in schools as some kind of brainwashing, but a lot of those are bad faith efforts that really understand that this is a powerful way for people to have agency in the world, is to understand how these systems work, understand how they might be manipulated, and find ways to find information that they can trust. And I think it's one of the most critical skills that we could be teaching children for the next generation, or maybe many generations to come.
Okay. Another question. Do you see the emerging federated social network impacting the way we report the news?
Yes, I can go. Yes,
All right.
absolutely. I think that the possibility that express yourself in social media, and everybody want to be an influencers, or offer news or information, it has become in the way that other platform, even traditional media, want to imitate them, to have more engagement, to have more traffic. And I think that everyone want to say something, and want to fill the gap with their possibility. And it's very dangerous, because the people are confused. The audience don't know what is a news organization, what is an influencer, who is saying the truth. And I think that is the reason why I believe I'm agree with Kate, that the more important thing that you can do is prepare from children to all ages, because we are seeing specifically among Spanish speakers that abuelas, grandpa and grandma are affected by this information in this kind of platform, and WhatsApp, for example.
Okay. Well, Tamoa, you have the last word. We actually are out of time, and that went quickly, and sad, because it was a very interesting conversation, and there's probably not enough time period for this. But it was very thought-provoking. I really want to thank Tamoa, Kate, Henry, and Molly again for just taking the time out to talk and to share the tools, the resources, the knowledge that you guys all have. I learned a lot from this, and I'm hoping that anybody that tuned into this did too. Our work is never ending. I feel like with journalism, every 6 months there's a new iteration of something else that you have to figure out and navigate. So I just know that that we have to keep on pressing on and continue doing that work and share the information that we have, because that's what's going to help to build literacy and trust, and make sure that we still have the facts. So many thanks again to the Inasmuch Foundation for its financial support of this program. Thank you to all the participants as well for the questions, the comments, and I hope you'll join us. The next segment of this Ethics in the Age of Disinformation series is next Wednesday. That's May 1st, and it's going to be at the same time. Then we'll focus on disinformation's role in the current election cycle and how journalists can counter tactics in play right now. And as a reminder, we'll share a link to this video this afternoon along with the resources, so you can keep mining this conversation for guidance. Thank you all again for being here and your interest in the National Press Club Journalism Institute. We hope to see you soon.